Hello, World Singers. My name is Brooke.
And I'm Tyler.
And this is Cosmere Conversations. Welcome back, everyone, and rejoice, for the time has come that we are able to share our panel from Dragonsteel Nexus.
That's right. There were so many people, including some patrons, who were able to meet us at Dragonsteel Nexus 2024.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Shout out to everyone we met at the panel. There was quite a few of you, and it was a highlight of the con.
We really enjoyed the opportunity to meet so many of you in person, but we also wanted to be able to share this panel with every one of you who was not able to be there. So we did a little bit of a recording of the Cosmere 401 Dragonsteel Nexus 2024 panel. I think that there is so much great information that we're still mining and have been mining for our episodes on the Cosmere Dictionary that you'll kind of see come up over the next couple of months, and especially when we get into Wind and Truth. But for right now, this is a reminder that this is hashtag some spoilers. This is not all spoilers all the time, because the panel itself recorded in December,
before Wind and Truth had a wide release.
The preview chapters, thank you. The preview chapters were out, and we addressed that up front. The panelists themselves have read the preview chapters. We don't really go into any type of speculation about what is mentioned in those preview chapters.
Correct.
And the panel itself, this whole episode, can be considered Wind and Truth spoiler-free, including the special section afterwards, because we're not only going to bring you the panel, we're also going to bring you some audience questions from the day of the panel, and we're going to give some answers and responses to those questionnaires.
Yeah, one of the downsides of the con, I think, is that there's just not enough time for everything, and there's definitely not enough time to take audience questions at the ends of panels. Everyone always has such great, unique, interesting questions. And so in lieu of being able to answer them in person during the panel, we have some recorded. Thanks for everyone who came over to ask us a question into the microphone. I'm really excited to finally be able to get to these. So what you're going to hear will be a sort of live podcast recording, so to speak, of the panel. And then we will jump into podcast questions from panel attendees.
I think this is going to be a really fun back and forth. You're going to be able to experience the panel as it happened, but then we are going to be able to take those specific questions and kind of dive a little bit deeper, bring in some words of brand and some research, and be able to respond to the questioners in a lot of detail.
Yeah, and probably be able to give better answers than we would have been able to during the panel.
Exactly. So know going into this that the audio quality of what you're going to hear during the panel is not top notch. It's about to change drastically, and then it will kind of revert when the panel ends and we start to answer the questions. We are so absolutely thankful for everyone who was able to attend. But now, here is Cosmere 401 from Dragonsteel Nexus. This is advanced Cosmere studies.
All right, keep filtering in as you do, and we're going to get going with Cosmere 401. This is advanced Cosmere studies. Thank you all so much for being here this morning. As a reminder, this is going to be a Wind and Truth spoiler-free panel. However, everybody up here has read through at least the preview chapter, so we're not going to mislead you purposefully in any way, but no spoilers for Wind and Truth.
Well, you guys won't mislead them purposely. I finished the book. It's fantastic. But I can't tell you anything because they told me I can't, so sorry. Employee.
Yeah.
Joy gets everything early.
Let's actually start off with those introductions for everyone. I'm just going to run through them all very quick. They're really awesome, and you should follow them all on their socials, beginning with Joy, who is a Dragonsteel employee. She's the head of the store lead and has been working for Dragonsteel since 2021. She also administrates the Cosmere and Stormlight Archive Facebook group, so you can find her there. Steve Pond is the head of Read and Find Out Cosmere YouTube channel and is known as the Cosmere Nut on many of the socials. He's got a bunch of stuff, but I consider him the Cosmere Master Timeline Specialist for all of the fantastic stuff he's done there, so you may have checked out that video in the past. Then we have Seth Tye, who makes primarily the short-form videos on TikTok, Instagram Reels, and YouTube. Thousands and thousands of subscribers, and one of just the nicest people you will ever have the pleasure of meeting. He also does a lot of the fan Discord, so you might have seen him on those channels if you are there. My name is Tyler Shotwell. I'm one of the co-hosts of Cosmere Conversations, but more importantly, this is Brooke Shotwell, my wife and co-host. We started in 2017 and have over 150 episodes, so when you're done with this, there's 200 plus hours of a bunch of Cosmere nerdiness you can go and listen to. I think that with that, I'm going to mainly step out for the rest of this panel, but can we give one big round of applause for all of the panelists? There is going to be a slide deck and presentation. I hope that you consider that more of a resource where I'll make that available later. It is not necessarily the most important thing that is going on today. What is important are these people up here. So listen to these people. If you want all of the notes, quotes, and resources, that's going to be available for digital download later. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to Steve. Can you give us a little primer on romantic theory?
So once upon a time, there were 3 realms. Done. Okay. For those of you who have read The Emperor's Soul, that's where we get the really clearest explanation of realmatic theory. Functionally, everything exists in 3 different realms or states of being. We've got the physical realm, where this is where we are. This is where you can touch stuff and where you exist primarily, where you see and hear and feel things. There also is the cognitive realm, where the mental aspects of things appear. It's basically think of Platonic forms. If any of you that's even more esoteric than romantic theory. So everything has a mind. This awesome sign that has my name on it knows that it has my name on it. And so in the cognitive realm, this would present itself as a piece of paper with text on it. It knows what it is. The chairs that you are all sitting on know that they are chairs meant to be sat upon, and they would present themselves in the cognitive realm appropriately. But there is also the spiritual realm, the place where things exist in their purest form. This is where we really get to Platonic forms here. There are perfect chairs that exist in the spiritual realm, and all cognitive aspects of them that know they are chairs are reflections of the perfect chair. And everything that exists in the physical realm that knows it's a chair is a representation physically of the perfect chair. Kinda, basically. So everything exists physically, everything knows what it is, and everything has a spiritual existence and identity of what it is. Does that make sense? We all good? Anyone have questions about realmatic theory? This is really important to have a fundamental understanding of before we get into everything else. Hand, yeah.
In the spiritual realm, is there a perfect person, was the question.
I would say in the spiritual realm, there is a perfect you. Not necessarily a single perfect person, but we all would exist in the spiritual realm as well. There is a perfect representation of us, who we truly are, without any filters of our own perception. We exist in the spiritual realm as we actually are, fundamentally, without any other cognitive biases or filters of any kind. So, yes, but a little more nuanced. We good? We clear?
Yeah.
Physical, cognitive, spiritual, golden, A+ everyone.
There's also some important kind of capital letter words that we see throughout Brandon's work. Some of those include connection, identity, intent, and investiture. We're going to go through just some quick definitions of those big words that are really vital to our understanding of realmatic theory and magic in the Cosmere.
I could hear the capitals when you said those. That was perfect.
Let's start with connection, capital C, connection, which is a spiritual attribute that kind of shows the ways that we are interrelated with people, locations, items, kind of anything that we are enmeshed with, have some kind of relationship with. We have a capital C, connection with. And those connections can be seen by certain individuals with powers mostly as threads that connect those things together. We see Dalinar able to see these connections. We also see design in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is able to kind of pull apart some threads of connection. We know that the heralds all have kind of a web of connection between them, as do the Yokihijo.
I have 2 children. There is a bedtime story that we will occasionally read to our kids called The Invisible Thread, which, hey, I heard applause, yeah, The Invisible Thread. It's all about oh, you are my child and I love you and we're all related and family has a invisible thread that connects us even if we're far apart. That is connection. I assume they are Sanderson fans and wrote the book about capital C connection, explaining it for small children.
Obviously, that's what it's for.
And Joy, could you help us out with the identity, that next big letter?
Okay, identity is important because knowing who you are makes a big difference in Cosmere magics. If you don't know that you can do something, you can't do something. It's part of, your spiritual DNA, if you will, but unless you know, if you have physical DNA and you don't know that you have, cancer screens, there's no way to go to the doctor and get your spiritual web read. So there's lots of people. Yet.
We're working on that.
You're working on that personally?
I know people.
Oh, okay. But if you could go and read your web, then you would know that you could do whatever abilities come from your world. But if you don't know that, you can't do it. So knowing the things with your connection to the magic or to the world or to other people makes you able to do things that you couldn't do otherwise. But you have to know yourself that you are able to do things and know other people are able to do things for it to actually be able to do whatever magic. Yes.
The question was, does Vin violate that rule at the beginning because she's doing things without necessarily knowing who she is and understanding her identity?
So Brandon knows that she has luck, so she knows that she has something. She doesn't know that she's mistborn, but she knows she's lucky.
Yeah, Brandon's addressed that before. So we have multiple instances of people accidentally using powers. Kaladin's first time, he has no idea what he's doing either, right? And Brandon has explained that intent can sometimes be unconscious, right? The intent can be your body's intent to protect itself. Even if the soul doesn't fully understand what it's doing. That's why when you're accidentally using it, you can't really use the full powers or the full aspects of it, but you can get the very minimal effect.
That ties into basic realmatic theory as well. You have that spiritual ideal of you, and that gets filtered through the cognitive aspect into the physical realm. So even if there isn't necessarily a cognitive awareness of a certain aspect of your spiritual identity, there is going to be filter through. So the spirit is very powerful. It's going to want to represent itself in the physical realm, even if you are not fully aware of it.
That brings us to another important capital letter word, intent. Seth, do you want to give us kind of a definition of capital I intent?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what we have up here is a spiritual concept in the Cosmere referring to a person's express will or purpose. Intent plays a vital role in the workings of most manifestations of investiture. So like we just said, intent can look like something like the body's intent to protect itself, or it can look something much more complex like the forming of an oath pact. We don't fully understand the intent of how that worked yet, but I suspect we will get some glimpses soon.
What do you think, Joy?
I'm not allowed to say. They told me I can't tell you anything. By that I mean these guys.
I
So
think
you
we
could
can
get them
say,
later.
though, even just based on Rhythm of War, we're starting to see just how important capital I intent is to all of the investiture and the Cosmere, and that the desire and the sort of framing of your thoughts around doing a thing is absolutely critical to being able to actually do the thing.
Yeah, now, I want to clarify, there is a difference in the Cosmere between intent and command, right? So a command is kind of the channel by which intent is focused. So in like Warbreaker, when somebody is awakening something, they have an idea of what they want, but awakening is much more specific and requires that intent to be focused through a command.
I think a good way to see this is with Sazed at the end of Hero of Ages. When he takes both powers, he could easily have just become immediately Discord and been, the bad guy. But he intends, and his intent has always been to be harmonious and to bring peace. And so that is what focused him to, do the good things that he's done. And we'll see how that plays out over time. So far,
Won't we just?
yes, won't we just?
So the question was, is a command, could it be defined as a unit of intent? I think there could be an argument for that.
I like that, actually.
Yeah.
That's a really elegant way of putting it.
They have to be a large unit of intent.
Yeah.
And right now, all of the questions really are fantastic. There's going to be time for them. I'll come around. We'll have a great bit, and not just from the people directly in front of us that we can hear. So thank you all so much. They really are great questions.
Yeah.
How about, Seth, just help people understand the magic or general investiture, and then we'll segue right over.
Investiture is, as we know, that's the general term for Cosmere magic power, right? In Star Wars, it would be called the Force. In Wheel of Time, it would be called the threads, right?
The one power.
The one power. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But yeah, so investiture is literally, it is condensed power. All things are investiture, and investiture is kind of all things, right? Investiture is, in the Cosmere, the purest form of matter. You have enough investiture, it does actually have weight and mass. And enough investiture, Brandon has said, could create a black hole due to that. But most investiture exists in the spiritual realm, and as a person, an investiture user is using their magic system, they are pulling investiture from the spiritual realm via some mechanic, whether it's a direct link or the investiture is being stored in their body, and then they use that to fuel the magic powers.
That was really great. I would love if we could all maybe get in sync, and maybe establish a little bit of a rhythm, because I have a question for you. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask a very basic yes or no question. And if it's yes, I want you to give us 2 claps, okay? 2 claps all together. Here's the question. Have you learned anything new yet? Oh, that was good. Okay, give me 2 stomps if you've learned nothing new yet. Okay, you're wrong. You learned our names.
Stop it.
On that, stop it, Steve. Could you tell us about some invested entities?
Absolutely. So,
We're getting into the meat now.
oh yeah,
here we go.
This is what we're really going for. So going along with realmatic theory and that concept of investiture, that is power exists in the spiritual realm, that can leak and sort of connect with other individuals. There are multiple invested entities, beings made up of investiture rather than made up of simply physical matter that we know of in the Cosmere. We have, of course, Adenalcium, which may or may not be a being. It could be maybe not a being. No one's told us yet, and
Brandon, tell
refuses.
us, please.
But Adenalcium, at least a force of some kind that was the original god of the Cosmere. Adenalcium, of course, split into 16 shards, which are invested beings, people with a significant amount of that spiritual investiture imbued inside of them. Shards are able to then create avatars, which are smaller and more different and kind of weird. We'll get to those. As well as mortal beings, people who are born and exist and die, but then maybe don't die, can be invested.
Or are really bad at dying.
Or, yes, who are particularly unskilled at dying can become an invested mortal being. Those are often known as slivers. Slivers are people that take up the power of a shard for at least a little bit and gain that increased investiture, and it sort of sticks to them. There are also splinters, which... Wait, did I just mess that up?
No, start with slivers. You're good.
Okay, cool. Splinters are different. Splinters are something else that I get confused, and we'll talk about those in a bit. And also cognitive shadows. Cognitive shadows are basically the soul of a person that sticks around because it got a little more juice.
Or is it a soul?
Bum, bum, bum.
We'll get into that.
We'll get into that.
Let's start with slivers. Let's do the slivers, splinters delineation here.
Indeed. So, I'm talking about this one. Perfect. So slivers, as we said, someone who held a large chunk of a shard's investiture. A shard is, of course, a significant chunk of the huge Adenalcium investiture. A sliver is someone who held a chunk of that shard, a fraction of a fraction, but it's still a freak ton of investiture. We have various examples of that. We all know that Kelsier, spoilers, is a sliver. He held preservation for a hot minute. So did Vin. She is technically a sliver. She had preservation. She didn't choose to stick around, but she is a sliver. We, of course, have the Sliver of Infinity, who is the Lord Ruler. He held the power at the Well of Ascension. And maybe Dalinar?
Yeah, Dalinar's a funky one, because even Odium himself uses the word ascended for what Dalinar did when he created that perpendicularity. The Stormfather seems to believe that Dalinar has additional powers that have never been possible before with Bondsmith. So Dalinar's a funky situation that we don't fully... Well, Joy might, but we don't fully understand it.
Joy's trying really hard.
This is so hard, you guys.
We need to get you a Malwish mask, just so you can...
And we have some beautiful artwork of some slivers.
Yeah.
Very pretty. Everyone should follow all of the people that make all of the art, because it's all gorgeous.
And as I said, the presentations will be available later. They have all of the artist name down at the bottom, but you cannot read that in the back. So you can get it, and it will be later. Joy, do you want to tell us about the Splinters? And maybe, give us some secret tidbits from behind the scenes.
If you want
No
to.
spoilers.
Okay, I'll try to not spoil anything. Splinters, though, I love splinters. Splinters are my favorite type of
I
investor.
hate them. They're just...
Okay. You need to work in inventory more. You're going to love them. Okay, so splinters are the little magic creatures that we see a lot. So it's Spren, it's your Seance, it's your Skays, Yogihijo, your Divine Breath, beings. So, Basher, that's not a spoiler anymore, is it?
No.
Okay.
Everyone knows who
Everybody
Thatcher
in here, you should know this.
is. Oh, dear.
Perhaps
Don't know that, you're in the wrong room, guys.
Read Warbreaker and come back.
What I think's cool about the Splinters is that people would call them different things on different worlds.
Yeah,
right?
they all have different names depending on what world you're on. We don't really see a lot of them on Scadrial, but in most other worlds there's something like that that's bled out and started to come alive a little bit. Not fully alive, but a little bit alive, and they like to hang out with real people.
Why don't we see Splinters on Scadrial? Good question.
I think that has to
Reasons?
do with how the power is focused, right? So Splinters require separated chunks of investiture that have gained sentience over time, whether through intent or by natural occurrences.
And those shards on Scadrial have been held really tightly.
Yes.
so far.
Mi-
So the mist
The
is
mist
kind
were
of,
preservation himself.
but that was more actual preservation.
Yeah, that
So-
the thing about Splinters, I think they're really, really fun.
You get them when a
investiture-
shard has been shattered
Yeah.
on or nearby. That's where they come from more. They don't just leak out by themselves.
Investiture wants to be aware of itself, right? And so when you have investiture that just stays in one place and doesn't do much, it wants to coalesce into something that is more
And it
self-aware.
will become alive in some form or another.
So, like, the reason the mists aren't a splinter is because the mists are being directly controlled by Laris, and it is still part of his essence. It's not
Yeah,
separated.
it's not separated, becoming self-aware.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
question
It's not
about
just-
metals on Scadrial in relationship to splinters. I think there is a difference here because the metals and god metals in particular are a physical manifestation of the shard's power. It's described more as the shard's body, like the power presenting in the physical realm as a physical thing, which is quite different, I think, from something like a spren, which is a mostly cognitive piece of power.
I honestly love the questions,
Friend,
and I promise we'll get to them. Let the
We'll get
panelists
there.
talk
We'll
about
talk
it.
about
We
it.
will get
Don't-
to that.
don't you fret.
Question. No, we'll get there.
Someone brought up an interesting question, though, about Vasher and the returned, and like,
Yeah.
are the returned splinters? And I think there's something interesting going on with the returned because they're kind of a splinter, but also cognitive shadows,
Yeah.
right? It's like a cognitive shadow that has been created through the use of a splinter
Right.
with
Yeah.
the divine breath.
Right.
Like, I would call the divine breath the splinter in that circumstance that is creating the cognitive shadow of the returned.
Yeah, when we talk about cognitive shadow, let's talk about that a little more. But there's arguments for, like, the returned, Vasher himself, whether or not they are a person that has been turned into a splinter, or if it is a splinter that has been given the memories and personality of a person.
Yeah, I heard that, ooh.
Yeah.
That's correct.
That is a good ooh to have. Yeah. There's always another secret, and Brandon doesn't like to give answers as much as he used to.
Should we talk a little bit about what cognitive shadows are?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Definition of cognitive shadow is a copy of the cognitive side of a person made by a deep amount of investiture, or sort of a spirit, soul, cognitive version of a person that has not gone to the beyond because of some kind of expansion of, again, their soul, spirit, question marks
There's
about
various
these
ways of doing
things.
that.
Right.
Yeah.
There's reasons. So the weird thing about cognitive shadows, is the argument of, is this still the person, or is this just a spiritual photocopy of that person?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I don't think we'll ever get an answer to that, frankly. But it is an interesting argument. Yasna would love to debate you on that.
One interesting thing about Returned is that we know they can't have children because that is where Ciri and Vivenna's, they get the royal locks because they're descended from someone who has been returned. So we don't ever hear about other cognitive shadows reproducing.
Right.
So-
Vasher explains it very interestingly
I love his
when he
explanation.
says that they're kind of like a fossil, where their spirit has been slowly replaced by investiture. He basically calls them a spren. So according to Vasher, it leads more credence to they're a spren copying a person. But
So functionally a
Kelsier seems to
splinter
be more
instead.
a person copying a spren, right? So there's various ways. There might be a Venn diagram. Unfortunately, Brandon hasn't fully laid it out for us yet.
And the circles of that Venn diagram may be basically one circle.
I think about it as like the sort of spirit web maybe of a person sort of imprinting into a piece of investiture, like the fossil analogy where the sort of shape of the person is still there. It looks like them, talks like them, but it's not actually them. It is something different.
So, okay, random, really strange side jump.
Go for it.
If it were possible to upload your consciousness onto the internet, would
That's
that
a good
be
metaphor.
a person, or would that be functionally a cognitive shadow?
That's a great.
I love
That's
that.
basically what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Mistborn Era 4?
Hey.
All right, so
You
let's.
heard it here first.
Steve's thrown it out. I want to get another response. So it is, if you upload to the internet, to the web, whatever, your mind, we'll say,
In its entirety.
in its entirety, is the thing that is uploaded you, the person, or a cognitive shadow? Okay? So if
That's
you think,
basically what a cognitive shadow is.
Yeah.
yeah, that's what we're describing. But is
yeah.
it still you? Is that the
Yes,
question,
that's the
Steve?
question.
Yeah, is that you? Like, if you die, but your consciousness has been uploaded to a giant supercomputer, are you there, or is it a cognitive shadow?
Okay, so if you
Is
think
it
it
a
is
fossil?
you, if you think it is you, give me 2 claps. If you think it's a cognitive shadow, something that's not you, give me 2 stomps.
That sounded like
We
more
have some
stomps.
really smart people
You
in here.
cynics.
That sounded like more stomps. So it sounds like this room kind of subscribes to the a cognitive
Ship of
shadow
Theseus,
is not a
yes.
person, but a spren copying a person.
Oh, why
Porque no
not
los
both?
dos. It could be. It very well could be.
Yeah. Perception of itself.
Perception
That's
is
a very
important.
interesting.
So maybe Vasher's
Yeah.
more spren-like because he perceives
Because he thinks
himself
of it.
that way, but others are less because they don't. Yeah.
I think one last thing to get into is since they are technically kind of more spren than person at this point, they do follow the same mindset of a spren, if to a lesser degree, where they become more and more idealized by one specific ideal the longer they exist. That is happening to Kelsier, right? He is losing his humanity and becoming more and more defined by one specific trait. We don't know what that trait is yet, but it seems to be kind of frightening to me.
I think we also have confirmation that cognitive shadows are influenced, similar to Spren, by the perceptions of other
Vasher
people.
Vasher outright says that. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
It's really crazy. I think that's partially what we see with the heralds and like why Shalash is always trying to destroy depictions of
She
herself.
doesn't like what people think of her. She wants to be thought of differently, but she can't break out of that because she's really, really old and people only think of her in one way. So.
Yeah, and like how weird to have your identity sort of being corrupted by other people's perception of you, right? And like actually changing who you are.
That is kind of like.
That's kind of life.
Okay, we'll take one question, but we don't have time for a lot of them. So he said, don't forget, Kelsier is being worshipped by 2 different groups of people in 2 different types of ways. And yes, that is going to do havoc on his soul. Vasher says the same thing, that when he was perceived as both Warbreaker and Peacegiver, he said that did some funky things to his soul.
Real quick, we'll run through some examples of cognitive shadows, just so that way we're all on the same page. We've got heralds, we've got fused, who are not as cool, but they are cognitive shadows. They keep coming back.
Leshwy's pretty cool.
Leshwy's really cool.
Okay?
I love Leshwy so
They've
much.
come back so many times, they're not quite the same anymore. Kelsier, we've got the Yoki Hijo, we've got all the nightmares, which is related to that. If you've read Yumi, great. The Shades, I love the Shades. I love the Shades. They're my favorite. We need more of them. And they have the Stormfather on this list. I don't want to talk about that anymore.
Stormfather is a funky one. And Joy, we're going to pick your brain later. But, so I want to see
You all
a show
go
of
away.
hands.
We have to talk to Joy.
If you think the Stormfather counts as a cognitive shadow of Tanavast, I want to see your hand up. If you think the Stormfather is his own spren, these hands down. Now put your hands up. All right, so more people think he's his own spren. No, the
guys are
Stormfather
special.
is weird because the Stormfather was his own spren, but through some unknown means, Honor did somehow implant the Stormfather with his, as we were saying, his digital personality,
I'm watching
basically.
your face.
He
Yeah.
uploaded his consciousness to the AI that is the Stormfather. What does that make the Stormfather now? Is he the old Stormfather with a new personality? Is he a continuation of Honor? Is Ultron
is
Jarvis?
Ultron
That's a great
Jarvis?
question. It's the ship of Thesis, right?
Yeah.
If you replace every board, is it still the same ship, or is it not the same ship? Yeah.
And Seth, do we have this quote from Kelsier, I believe, up on the screen right now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Brooke, can you read this out with me? I think this would be maybe helpful.
Sure. Let's see. What about the Lord Ruler, Kelsier said? You say that everyone has to bend to death, but obviously that isn't true. He is immortal.
He's a special case, Fuzz said, perking up. He has ways of not dying in the first place.
And if he did die, Kelsier pressed, he'd last even longer on this side than I am, right?
Oh, indeed, Fuzz said. He ascended, if just for a short time. He held enough of the power to expand his soul.
Got it. Expand my soul.
And that question of the expansion of the soul is seen in several versions of these cognitive shadows. We're talking about a bunch of them, but I think we have the Heralds and the Returned kind of next up on the list.
Yep. Joe, you want to tag team this?
Yeah, we'll go.
Okay, so the Heralds and the Fused are very similar, but created through very different intents, right? So the Fused happened first. We don't know exactly how long it took, but the Fused happened. Odium basically said, hey, my chosen warriors, I'm going to keep bringing you back. And then Honor and Cultivation, through some unknown means, created the Oath Pact with the Heralds. Ishar might have had a lot to do with its creation, or he might have just kind of been the vessel of Honor's intent at that time. Mm-hmm. But they basically created the Oath Pact to stop the Fused from coming back. The Heralds are a funky one in that they're different from most other cognitive shadows in that they have the ability to create a physical body every time they're reincarnated.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting distinction between those two groups, that the Heralds somehow get like their own bodies recreated for them every time.
Yeah. Is it the same body? Is it a new?
Or is it just investiture made into flesh?
Now, that's the ship of Theseus on like 3 different levels.
Are they so highly invested that they just become themselves? That is, I think, a possibility.
That's what I think.
Yeah, and there's an aspect of physics that I don't understand, but that Brandon has mentioned before, that all of these things are the same and can move between the different states that they are in.
Oh,
You
like
know,
investiture matter energy?
Exactly,
Yeah.
thank you.
And the
In our
Heralds do
reality.
something like that, where upon death they're transported to Braze through some way. We don't know if it's like a boom, they're there, or if they have to traverse Shadesmar, but they do. Their body does physically die, and they are now a spren for all intents and purposes until they're reincarnated again with a brand new, undamaged body.
Yeah. So the poor Fused, they just have to steal other people's bodies. They don't have as much
Fused are
power.
fine. Poor Parshendi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the Fused aren't fine.
They're not fine. They're so sad, and I hope that they eventually can get some rest, because this is really rough for their souls. It's really rough for the people that they take over and basically kill to take over their bodies. And nobody likes it, and everybody's sad and angry. So much angry.
This is pretty different from other cognitive shadows that we see, though. Like, the Returned can only come back once. You know,
Yep.
like the Heralds and the Fused come back over and over again. The Returned get their one shot to like come back and seemingly accomplish a goal or something, in that they are coming back to change the future that they see when they die the first time. So it's kind of interesting to see the way that these different cognitive shadows have very different functions seemingly in the world, because also Returned have to continue to consume investiture. I guess maybe we don't know what would happen to the Heralds if they left Rashar. Like, maybe they don't have to consume investiture because there's so much readily available.
I think we haven't seen enough points of view from Heralds to know for sure.
Yeah,
We
that's
do
true.
have this quote on screen here where it says, "The bond that keeps us alive. You sever that and we slowly decompose into ordinary souls." So something to do with how the Oath Pact was created, that bond between the 10 Heralds does
that's-
lend them their immortality.
That provides the extra juice that does the soul expansion.
Yeah.
And I'm out in the audience. See, I told you that I was going to take questions from people.
Whoa.
Who's got a question?
Tyler's over there.
I know. I move around. Everybody's got to find. Yeah, what's up? What's the question? Okay, the question is about Marsh. What is he? How does he fit into Sliver, Splinter,
great
or Cognitive Shadow, or maybe something else? Panelists.
I don't think he counts as a cognitive shadow yet.
No.
He is a mortal who has extended his life through investiture. I could see an argument that perhaps over extended time that could cognitive shadowify
I mean,
him.
he still needs ADM to keep himself alive, so he can't be fully the cognitive shadow or a splinter or something yet, but I think he's working on it.
If we talk about like that Vasher's analogy of the cognitive shadow is a fossil of the original person, Marsh isn't fossilized yet. He's still kicking. He definitely is expanded, but the original aspect of his soul has not become a fossil at this point.
I could also see an argument for he's probably consumed enough atium and possibly some Loracium, I'm not sure, that he could possibly be considered a sliver of ruin and or preservation.
That would be interesting.
Do we want another one?
Yeah.
Perfect. My friend up in the front, you got this red hat on right here. I see you with your vest.
Red hat.
What's your question? That was a good question, and you did a great job speaking loud. Innate investiture, and is that different than just your soul?
It could be argued that all people that exist in the Cosmere are invested beings, because I think the soul, that part of you that exists in the spiritual realm, is investiture.
Yeah.
I mean, spiritual energy is investiture, and the soul is made up of spiritual energy.
And there's a specific moment in Secret History when Kelsier remarks that souls and metal look the same in their version of Shadesmar, which tells me that both of those things have a bit of investiture in them.
I'm going to refer us back to the Lost Metal, where they're doing hemalurgic experiments, and they extract investiture from regular people.
Yeah.
And it is very painful.
Gross.
Yes. So there is a wob that kind of relates to that. Scadrians have more than most others. However, if we look at Warbreaker, drabs are the Cosmere's version of us, people that don't have innate investiture.
Not quite.
Not quite. Nope.
Drabs are less invested than normal standard humans.
Right. Okay. Yeah. You're right.
Yeah, because in Nalthians, we have the sort of innate piece of investiture, the like soul bit that is invested a little bit, and then they also have a breath, which is another piece of investiture. But when their breath is given or taken, the breath piece of investiture takes with it a little piece of their innate investiture also.
Yeah, just a
so they are slightly less invested than normal.
Yeah. What we talked about with other invested beings, like investiture is sticky. If you hold more investiture for a bit, parts of it are going to want to stay stuck to your own innate investiture, your soul.
And if it leaves, it's going to take some of that part that it's stuck with it.
Yes.
It's
like we took the Band-Aid off. It's painful.
One more question.
What would you consider Yumi to be?
This is such a good question.
At the point of the book where we see her, she's definitely a cognitive shadow.
Mm-hmm.
What her people were before is probably more like...
The Yoki-Hijo are Splinters.
Yeah,
I believe.
Yoki-Hijos are...
Yeah, and then after she goes through the father machine, she becomes a cognitive shadow. The splinter chunk of investiture is like the thing that imprints Yumi into it, creating the cognitive shadow of Yumi.
So we're running out of time. I'm going to throw some of these slides up real quick if you guys want to take a picture of them, if you want to. If you don't have to.
I would love to continue to debate all of this. You guys, who else has a booth here?
I have a giant store.
Joy has a giant. Joy has the largest booth of all of us.
I am technically an exhibitor. The Dragonsteel store.
I think we want to leave you all with the question, just to kind of ponder, what is the Stormfather?
Yeah, that kind of ties together all these things that we've been talking about: cognitive shadows, splinters. What does it mean to ascend and potentially be a sliver or a...
Dawn shards are completely
Dawn
different.
shards are
That's
not
a whole other
entities.
panel.
Yeah, that's Cosmere 501.
Yeah.
We'll have that next year.
Or the year after.
Right.
But
Wait,
come,
year
come
after,
find
what do you
all
know,
of us
Joy?
around the con. Let us know your questions. We'd love to talk to you. I think, do we have all of our contact
Yeah,
info
if
up
anybody
there?
wants to follow any of us here, these are our QR codes on screen. I'm going to leave them up here. Please come find us. We want to talk to you guys.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Upstairs.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah,
Go with
That was it. Cosmere 401, or at least all of Cosmere 401 that we had time for in about 45 minutes.
It was a bit rushed, and we could feel that at the time, but that is why we are so thankful to the people who came up afterwards and gave us some questions. We have shared these questions with our fellow panelists, so you might be able to see them respond to your specific questions if you are interested. But what we're going to do right now is just kind of go back and forth. I'm going to play the recording from the day of, so it is a little bit better when you're hearing these people, and then it will come back over to us for the responses to those questions.
First up, we're going to hear from a couple of people that had kind of similar questions. So we'll play them both and then we'll respond to both of their questions. These are going to be from Brad and Greg.
Can you give me your name? And if there is a specific channel or one of the creators that you were hoping would answer this question, I'll pass this on to them specifically. If it's just a general question, that's totally cool too.
Yeah, my name is Brad. This is just a general question. And there's a lot of nuance in it, I think. So on the panel, you guys described cognitive shadows as copies of someone's, the remnants of what they had in the cognitive realm when they died. But is that something, like in my head, I always imagined it as like the cognitive portion of who that person was is just what is left, not specifically a copy. So is it something that has been defined as a copy when they die, or is that, or were you guys just calling it that just because there's like, that's what some people, like you use the like the computer, if you uploaded your brain into a computer, that's specifically a copy. But like if you took my brain out and put my brain into a robot, then that's not, like, that's how I kind of imagined it as like a better analogy. So I don't know if that's been defined or if that's just the way that some people in the Cosmere debate it even, right?
Sure. Hi, Greg. Any of you can answer it, but I'm a big fan of Tyler and Brooke's podcast, so thank you for Cosmere Conversations. I kind of want to talk along the same lines as the last question. You spent a lot of time talking about cognitive shadows. Is it the real person or not? I want to pose a theory and hear you guys talk about it. I think it starts as the real person. I think the imbuement of investiture over time does what Vasher literally describes to us. It takes their spirit web. It replaces the malleable form it was before with a hardened investiture core that is no longer changeable. That's how it feels to me, and I want to hear what you guys think about it.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I think it makes sense that we put Brad and Greg's together because those two questions really do kind of flow one into the other.
Yeah, they're both getting at this idea of kind of what exactly is a cognitive shadow. Is it still the person?
Mm-hmm.
Is it not the person? Does it undergo a transition over time in between those two things? I really love both of the metaphors that these people used. I love the idea of uploading your brain versus literally physically taking your brain out and putting it into a robot and the differences there.
Yeah, that's a great distinction that Brad brought up. And I think we'll play around with that idea a little bit more in detail. But you also liked what Greg said as well.
Yeah, this idea of moving from something malleable to something immutable. And is that transition something that happens immediately upon becoming a cognitive shadow? Or is there kind of a process of becoming a cognitive shadow in which you are over time moving from being changeable to immutable? I think by definition, if something becomes immutable, it is no longer the living being that it was.
Interesting.
I think like by definition, you as a living human are changeable.
Okay, that's actually a great distinction because it's something that the Spren talk about a lot in Rhythm of War, what we learned from Maya, that the Spren are able to
they
change.
Have choice and agency.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. So you're saying that a cognitive shadow, if they are perhaps not able to change, then they certainly cannot be a real person.
Yes, exactly. So to Greg's question of like, is this the real person or not? If they are no longer changeable, it is not the real person anymore. It is something else.
I love that distinction. We talk in a little bit more detail in our Cosmere Dictionary episodes, both Volume 1 and Volume 2, about the differences and the distinctions between all of these terms. But I try to, in those episodes, really define the difference between what is a soul in the Cosmere and what is a cognitive shadow or the predecessor to a cognitive shadow. Because I think what you're saying is that something happens the instant someone dies and there is a splitting or a distinction. Is that correct? Or am I pushing too much on you?
Yeah, I would say, at least up until this point, my conception has been that it pretty much happens immediately. That if someone becomes a cognitive shadow, it happens all at once, that the impression is made of the person into the investiture. And then all that is left is the fossil. As Greg referenced, Vasher's description of how a cognitive shadow is made and this idea of the fossil, again, by definition, a fossil is not the thing itself. Like when we find dinosaur fossils, we're not finding
dinosaur bones.
Right, correct. Maybe we have found a couple actual dinosaur bones. I know we have found for sure some pelts or skin and things like that in very rare, very, very rare circumstances. But for most of the time, if you're looking at a dinosaur fossil, it is not a bone. It is the impression of the bone that has been made into dirt and rock and sediments of other kinds. So it is absolutely not the original thing. This also kind of brought to mind that really famous artwork by Rene Magritte, Socinus Pazun Peep. This is not a pipe. This has totally become memeified and like copied over to tons of different things. You've definitely seen this before. But the point of that artwork is to highlight the difference between a representation of something and the actual thing. So a picture of a pipe is not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe.
Exactly.
And to me, that is the difference between a cognitive shadow and the person that they once were. Yes, it is an impression. It is a representation of that person, but it is not the person themselves.
I agree with that take. And I think that if we look at Mistborn Secret History, we can see this distinction on the page because Kelsier describes viewing souls as little flames in the cognitive realm. And he also describes metals that way, which is, something we've talked about and mentioned quite often. But those little flames are different than what he talks about seeing shortly after he dies, which are like little ghosts or shadows of a person. And those little shadows normally have a conversation with Fuzz, preservation, and then they fade into the beyond. And the whole thing we learn in Mistborn Secret History is that Kelsier's little shadow runs to the Well of Ascension, becomes expanded, and that thing that he was, whether you're calling it a soul or a cognitive aspect, or you label it some different way, but it is that thing that is expanded and that remains and becomes the cognitive shadow. This is the biggest thing I believe we were trying to get at in the actual Cosmere 401 panel, is that there's a distinction between what the cognitive shadow becomes and then the instant someone dies. And I think that's where Brandon is still not trying to get locked down. And instead, we have this little gap period where somebody dies, their physical body is no longer functioning. What happens in the spiritual realm is unknown at this moment, but we see what happens in the cognitive realm, which is that little flame stops existing, and instead there is a little shadow. And the shadow, or the cognitive aspect, is the thing that potentially can be expanded. So to go back to Brad's original question, my belief is that this represents your first example, that this is a copy of the thing rather than the physical brain being taken out and put to a robot, but with magic involved. I think that what we have in the description so far is of a copy of a thing. And that's why I feel
Yeah.
cognitive shadows in general scary and bad, and I'm worried about them.
Yeah, I think just to answer Brad's question like very explicitly, yes, it is a copy. It has been defined in that way by characters like Vasher, calling it a fossil, which again is a copy. And also in a few words of Brandon where he has said, or at least hinted very heavily, that this is more of a copy of a person than the person themselves. I think maybe one day we could see hemalurgical experiment that can use a spike to like transfer identity or something that would be more like Brad's idea of taking the brain out
Wow,
and
that's
putting
great.
it in a robot or something like that. I think something like that is probably possible in the Cosmere, but it is not cognitive shadows. And then also to answer the kind of the end of Brad's question, is this debated? Yes, it is. This is still very much an ongoing area of knowledge, both for us in the Cosmere fandom and for people in world in the Cosmere. There are some differing research, some differing opinions on exactly what is going on here among scholars at Silverlight, etc. So we know that there are some different understandings in world that I imagine will probably stay shadowed for a while, but then eventually start to become clear as we move further forward in the Cosmere.
That's a great point. This is not a Wind and Truth spoiler, but is directly from Brandon's spoiler Q&A at Nexus 2024. He talked about how BEUs, while it is used among many scientists in the future, like the Scadrians we see in the Sunlit Man, it is not universal, and that there might be people who understand what you mean by BEUs, but then are still doing a local translation or a local conversion to things that make more sense to them. And so I think the same is philosophically implied when it comes to these questions about cognitive shadows. There's people in world who are saying, that's a soul.
Right, who are like using different vocabulary words to understand the mechanics.
Exactly. But Chris is specifically saying, I don't want to call it a soul. And she uses aspect or a cognitive aspect as their description. And so that's kind of the distinction that we will continually see around this definition of cognitive shadow, because it's very hard to understand, and then especially try to imagine it not as the reader, but as a person in world, seeing these things and then trying to explain them.
Yeah.
I think we have the benefit of being outside of the circumstance. But what I'd really love to do now is go to another question and kind of move us in a different direction a little bit.
Hey, my name is Austin. I have just a general questions about you guys' opinions on what do you think the relation between the pulses that Allomancers can sense on Scadrial and the rhythms on Roshar are. If they are the same mechanics being seen different ways, or if there's more to it than that.
So what do you think about that question for Austin? Rhythms versus the pulses from Scadrial?
I think that they are operating on the same fundamental mechanics, that we know that there is a auditory or just like sound wave aspect to investiture, and whether that is the pure tones of specific shards or what I would call like a subtone sort of something like Stormlight, right? Like I imagine that the tone of Stormlight is different but slightly related to the tone of Honor.
That's really fun. I actually like that idea a lot. A subtone.
Yeah. And so for me, I would say that the allomantic pulses specifically that we see firsthand in Mistborn when bronze mistings are using their skills, or Mistborn's burning bronze, would be more like the subtones, where they are perceiving the specific sound waves of each metal's investiture. I don't know that we've seen tones of the shards on Scadrial. Do you recall that at all?
No, but every hint about hearing something or a wave
Right.
of sound is interesting and should be picked out on a reread. I think that Austin has the right of it, that the Scadrian pulses and the Rasharan rhythms are related, but it is important to remember that Rashar is older than Scadrial. Rashar was a planet
Yeah.
that existed prior to Adonalsium shattering, and Scadrial was created by ruin and preservation. So I think that the rhythms that, for example, the singer populations here, I think are older than the shattering of Adonalsium or any of the shards.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would say that I think Austin is correct that these are the same mechanic.
Right.
In that this is a underlying aspect of investiture, period. So basically any investiture is going to have this sound wave tone component to it just by virtue of being investiture. It might be more pronounced on Rashar.
That's what I think, that there's some type of Rasharan amplifier that's like boosting the signal, plugging in your electric guitar versus just strumming the chords as they exist. It only really becomes magical when
guess.
you plug it in.
Yeah, or maybe it's not a planet-wide thing. Maybe it's just the singers that have a step up in perceiving that aspect of investiture.
Yeah, that's a good distinction.
Yeah.
And like, how much is it planetary versus just the singers are better at it? I actually think that Rashar is closer to a musical or sound planet, where Nalthis and Life Sense is more the visual and color-based planet.
Yeah, light waves.
Exactly. But Brandon has said previously that light and sound are from the same and are kind of interchangeable in that way. So I think that whatever is going on Scadrial is probably the best example of Cosmere neutral. Brandon has also said this about Scadrial itself, is like, it is the most
Earth-like. It is the closest to Earth, yeah.
Right. And so if I just consider that default, then the pulses on Scadrial are what we could consider default across the Cosmere. And then what makes Rashar unique is perhaps that there's some type of sound-based amplifier.
Sure.
And that's where you get the true tones of Rashar.
Yeah.
Why that happens or what that means going forward, we don't know. Let's go to the next question. This one is, I believe, from Cody.
Hi, my name's Cody. General question. Spren were referred to as splinters, but that would require something having been splintered. As far as we know, Spren have existed for a long period of time. So just a kind of general theory of what caused Spren to manifest on Roshar when they don't exist on other cognitive realms.
Wonderful question and a perfect setup for Wind and Truth. I think that there was some basically disagreement on semantics about what are we calling Spren versus what are we calling the other things that exist in the rest of the planets, because I would say that Spren do exist on other planets.
Yeah, I think this is another thing that comes down to vocabulary. We can say Spren, we can say Seons, we can say spirits on Komashi. These are all essentially the same thing, which is why characters like Vasher have come up with the term Type 1 invested entity,
right,
so that it kind of encapsulates all of the different ways that these can manifest, because they do look different on different planets. Each planet has its own properties and its own kind of flavor of investiture, but they all fall into that same category of Type 1 invested entity. I'm curious also if this question from Cody is maybe asking about the original creation of Rashar. There is a word of Brandon, Cody, that Adonalsium at some point in the past was on Rashar, and that some latent investiture from Adonalsium itself is what led to at least some of the Spren on Rashar. Some of Adonalsium's investiture was left on the planet, and therefore Spren arose over time. So in terms of did something get splintered? I think this is also kind of a vocabulary question. Yes and no, not violently, but just in the sense that Adonalsium shaved off a splinter of itself and left it on the planet to become Spren. Yes.
Yeah, there's actually from 2016 during the Calamity release party, there's a word of Brandon that I think would be helpful here. It's not 100% definitive, as in we could just say this and then everything is over. It's still leaving open all of this room for discussion, but it's existed at least since 2016. So I think that the history is where all of this is coming from and like where these distinctions are coming from. This involves a questioner named Little Wilson who takes a moment to get their question in order, but they said, quote, because I was kind of going with shattered and splintered. So shattered would be kind of what I thought was going on with devotion and dominion. And then splintered would be more like, well, you had mentioned that Honor kind of splintered himself off to create the Spren before, end quote, and then Isaac, Stuart, and Brandon pick up. And do you want to read that section for us, Brooke?
Yeah, Brandon says, quote, all those Spren are still Honor when he was alive. Like, yes, those are little splinters of Honor, but they're still Honor. It's not like he's diminished because his whole essence is the world, right? There's no diminishing that. And so the thing that we're talking about is the fracturing of the mind and the killing of the shard, end quote. So I think that really makes a clear distinction between what we would consider being splintered and what we would consider being shattered. And I think we talked about this a bit in our Cosmere Dictionary episode, as well as in the panel. We have to keep in mind that although even when a bit of investiture gets broken off from a shard, or a shard is broken off from ad nauseam,
right,
they are still all connected in the spiritual realm. There's still this sort of end point where the family tree comes together. So even though Syl is completely her own entity and has her own personality and mind and life that she is living as herself, as a Spren, as a splinter, she is still part of Honor's investiture, which is also still a part of the greater pool of investiture that was once ad nauseam.
Yeah, it's not 100% distinct, and I do think that the phrasing and the terminology has led to confusion. I like the distinction between shattering as what has happened to devotion and dominion, and arguably to Honor and to ad nauseam. I like that those things are all kind of lumped together. Now, is that 100% accurate? No, it might not be. But
Yeah.
I think that when we talk about splintering, one of the key aspects, in my opinion, that kind of like separates and makes it distinct is that splintering is somewhat voluntary, either purposefully or accidentally. I think ad nauseam on Rashar just kind of like accidentally splintered himself. There was so much power that they simply left it behind on Rashar. Whereas, for example, we think Endowment is purposefully splintering herself
Right.
to create divine breath for the returned.
Yeah.
But it's not damaging. It's not splintering herself in a negative fashion, at least as far as we're concerned.
I would more characterize it as like a difference in continuity of intent.
Okay.
So
Say more.
Yeah, I'm thinking to just go with your examples that you just gave. Ad nauseam's creation of the Spren on Rashar, I think more of as like dead skin cells.
Wait, so the Sprenner dead skin cells?
Yeah, like
Okay.
just by virtue of being alive, you know, you and I walk around our house and then our house gets dusty because we're like shedding things.
You're really making
unfortunately.
me upset, but
I
go
know.
ahead. Continue.
And ad nauseam, just by virtue of being a thing in the world, is sort of sloughing power
Right.
a little bit. And so everywhere it goes, it leaves some of those little sloughs of power around. That's what creates the Spren. So like, yes, they can be considered splinters. That's just what we're calling them. But they're just these little pieces of his power that got left. Then you can absolutely have shards either breaking off pieces purposefully to create new things or being in interactions with each other, maybe violent interactions.
Exactly.
Becoming splintered. However, to me, the difference between splintered and shattered, like I said, is the continuity of intent. So when ad nauseam shattered, it became no longer ad nauseam, versus Honor can be splintered. Honor can be entirely splintered, but it has not become a new thing.
That's
If
really
it were
great.
possible, I think you would probably have to use the Dawn Shards to then further splinter honor. If you did that and it turned into two different things,
Okay.
it turns into nobility and
Justice
love or
or
something.
something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
whatever. Two other things. Then it has been shattered. It is no longer honor. It is something different completely.
That is a fun distinction, one that I think we will have many a year to discuss. But the basic vocabulary breakdown is why we are doing this Cosmere Dictionary series and this kind of ongoing series, because it's so important to understand these kind of small differences, and in world they're used the same. In book they're used the same. That presents confusion or the possibility of misunderstanding. But I think that Cody has some aspects that are correct in that Spren are referred to as splinters, but that there is a difference when it comes to something like the shattering, or what it would mean to shatter a new shard, shatter the shard of honor, as you just gave an example of. Wonderful question. Thank you so much. Let's go on to the next.
This one is from Erin, who was also a panelist on the fashion in the Cosmere panel, and she had an incredible cosplay. I would love to talk with her more.
My name is Erin, and anybody can answer this. I'll be theorizing about this on my stuff too. But as far as splinters of the various shards and their representations go, we know that there are splinters of odium. What led him to splinter himself? Does he have the precision to splinter off smaller pieces than just destroying a complete shard, the way that Virtuosity splintered herself, versus him destroying other shards in their entirety? And how has that weakened him in the battle against honor and cultivation? How can they exploit that and the fact that he is the broken one where 3 of 16 reigned?
Wow, Erin, coming in hot with the hard-hitting, deep questions.
Yeah, this is a professional level question. We love to see it. And I think that you're right. We are going to continue to be speculating about this. But the first part of your question regards the splintering of odium.
Yes.
And did he splinter himself?
There are splinters of odium that is confirmed via word of Brandon. The unmade are splinters of odium.
Yeah, this actually dates back to 2015. I looked up the specific word of Brandon just for you, Aaron, and it comes from the questioner, Weary Writer, who said explicitly, "Are the unmade splinters of odium?" And Brandon says, "Yes, good guess."
Yeah.
So that is dating back quite a while now. And I think that the secondary question that Aaron brings up is, did that weaken him in the battle against honor and cultivation? Now, we think that the basic back and forth, the arms race kind of played out like this. First, there were fused from odium. Then there were heralds from honor with maybe some help from cultivation. We don't know. And then there were the unmade. How the unmade were created, what were they when they were just made, we don't know.
Right, because we do hear from, I think, Ja and Not that they were made and then they were unmade. So it's unclear if they were originally created by odium as splinters, or if they were something else, and then odium broke off a big enough piece of odium's power and like imbued it into these things that already exist, then making them the splinters of odium.
Yeah, so if that's our starting point, or I guess that's our end point, we have splinters of odium in the form of the unmade, then we can do a lot of speculation backwards to try to figure out when it happened, why it happened, or what was the mechanism.
Except that we don't have any of that information.
We have absolutely none. It's complete speculation, which is my wheelhouse. And I think that the returned are actually a good example. We believe that the returned are cognitive shadows that are then imbued with the power of a splinter, the divine breath from endowment.
Well, the splinter is the thing that makes them a cognitive shadow.
Right.
Yeah.
The divine breath is the thing that makes them a cognitive shadow.
Yes.
So they might be a cognitive aspect, but then the combination of those two things, as we mentioned in the first question, the fossil is created by the splinter itself.
Yeah.
This is kind of what I imagine happened with the made and unmade, is that there was something akin to a spren, like a type 1 invested entity, or akin to a type 2 invested entity. And then Odium showed up with a splinter of themselves and imbued that type 1 or type 2, I don't know which one, but imbued it with enough power to become the quote unquote unmade.
Yeah. And then in terms of how this like weakened him in the battle, this is my conception right now. I don't think that making splinters weakens a shard or ad nauseam. As we just said in our last response, just because a piece has been broken off doesn't actually diminish the overall power, because it all exists in the spiritual realm.
And that last question, we were specifically talking about the spren. And I think this is where the debate begins, is like type 1 invested entity versus type 2, because I would maybe see the argument for, no, if you are splintering yourself like Odium does to create the unmade, like endowment does to create the returned, or arguably what Honor does when he creates the Honor Blades, that does represent a weakening of their power. And my imagination is that this back and forth, this arms race, basically involves an arms race going down for the shards. They are weakening themselves each time they do something to splinter themselves. And we just see a matching of those things, because it's like, take a chunk of my power, but give it to the mortals and then see what the mortals can do with it.
That just doesn't line up with what Brandon has said and like what his conception is around how the power works. So just from what I've read in Words of Brandon, I don't think that splintering reduces a shard's power in any way, because that power is still connected to them. It still exists. The spiritual realm doesn't really care what form it takes. It is still connected to the shard. So again, unless a shard is shattered and becomes something else, it is going to maintain the same level of power. Now, if a shard like Odium, if Odium was to become shattered, then it would be weaker, because the pieces of itself that were of the other intent would no longer be connected to it.
Okay, so you're saying that if Odium was broken down, then you could not recombine to equal the level of Odium's power, because you would be permanently missing the splinters that we now see in the unmade.
Right. Yeah. So if you splinter, or if you shattered Odium and let's say just split it into passion and hatred,
Okay.
then any of the pieces that are connected to passion are no longer connected to hatred.
But are you saying there's a whole third category of the splintered things?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
and then the unmade still exist
Right.
as splinters of Odium, and Odium just doesn't exist anymore, but that doesn't mean they're not splinters of Odium. Similar to the way that there are Spren on Rashar that are Adonalsium Spren. Adonalsium's not around anymore, but that is where the investiture originally came from. They are not splinters of Honor specifically.
That's a powerful distinction, and I do think that we might get some more information in Wind and Truth going forward. But tell me what you just sparked. I saw it go off in your eyeballs.
I guess we just didn't fully answer Erin's question, because then she's asking like how was he weakened? What did weaken him? And it seems to me like that had something to do either with his previous encounters with shards, that there was something that happened in those encounters that did damage him. I don't know if it was a splintering. It may have been something else going on, because we also know that the shards are bound by agreements. There are things that they decided like before they took up the shards of Adonalsium that are binding to them in some way. And
Certainly.
so either because Odium betrayed those original agreements, or potentially because of some agreement between Odium and Honor, and like Odium not paying attention to that or going against that agreement, I think those are more the things that are weakening or damaging to the shards.
I would probably agree. There might be an original agreement before the shattering of Adonalsium, and then there might be secondary agreements with the shards themselves. So Odium and Honor, or Odium and Cultivation and Honor.
Yeah, because I think Honor, or maybe just Wit, has said things like, oh, Odium can't do that, or he risks like going against their agreement and therefore opening himself up to retaliation or something like that.
But I think the actual weakening of Odium happened in the clash that led to Threnody. That was the destruction of the shard Ambition. And while Ambition was not living on Threnody, the after effects are felt on Threnody. So, there's some speculation that maybe Mercy was involved in that event. Perhaps it took a splinter, a weakening splinter this time of Odium, to completely shatter Ambition.
They could have also still known where the Dawn Shards were at that point, if it was very soon after the original shattering and ascension of these vessels.
Right.
Like, what if Odium was just super crafty and found out like where the Dawn Shards were hidden? Like, we have no idea how they got those weapons, what they did with the weapons after the shattering. Like, who knew about it? Nobody knows. So it could also be that someone had a Dawn Shard and attacked Odium with that, or Odium attacked Ambition with that, and therefore there were other ramifications that led to the weakening.
Yes, I do think that the weakening of Odium did happen prior to their arrival in the Rasharan system. And then there might be further weakenings because of what has transpired in Rashar's past, which we don't know. We might get more information in Wind and Truth about that circumstance.
In terms of the question about the Broken One reigns, I don't know, to be honest. I think that's maybe still an oracle for a future time.
You don't necessarily think that's Odium now. That could be Odium in the future. Like, he is not reigning currently, but maybe he will in the future?
Yeah, or I guess I don't know if he would be considered broken now, or if it's referring to some future breaking. We certainly see him being weakened. We could consider him being kind of metaphorically broken in just that he's being a jerk to everyone, And like sometimes we see people just like being kind of dumb and we're like, oh God, he's kind of broken, Like,
okay,
I don't know if it's like that, or I guess, I'm still unclear on exactly what is meant by the Broken One and exactly what is meant by reigns. And I don't know if we've seen it yet.
So really mine's a two-parter. So my name's Kyle. My question is, can a cognitive shadow pick up a shard of Adonalsium and become the vessel? And two, if Kelsier is being worshipped by two different cultures in two different ways, is he subtly setting himself up to be worshipped as preservation and ruin and not harmony to make Discord easier to control?
Kyle, what a question. Longtime patron Kyle, we really appreciate your question. I think that the first part is about, can a cognitive shadow pick up a shard of Adonalsium? I'm going to come in hot with this response. Absolutely not. 100% not. Here's my argument for it. When we see shards die, Ati and Laris, their bodies drop from the nether. We see this with Odium. Race's body drops. It's not that Taravangian is turned into a cognitive shadow or cognitive aspect.
Right.
All of Taravangian goes to become Odium, and that means the physical body as well. This is the distinction, I believe, between cognitive shadow. Cognitive shadows don't have bodies. There is no connection to the physical realm anymore.
Can it be a vessel if it doesn't have a body?
I would say no.
Like, my body is my vessel. It carries my consciousness around. And if I didn't have a body, I can't be a vessel because I'm just a floaty who knows what.
Yeah, I think that basically more is required. And this is where I'd come back to the what is a soul debate. I don't think you can have a soul without a body. I think you need all three realms to be connected, and a vessel of a shard or a dawn shard would need all three realms to be connected.
Yeah.
I don't think that a cognitive shadow, which is only the cognitive realm, can take up the power of a vessel.
Right. Okay. Speculation, because hopefully we're going to find out more about the Stormfather in Wind and Truth, but we have been talking a lot among ourselves and among other people about this question of like, is the Stormfather a splinter? Is it a sliver? What exactly does this count as? And the Stormfather kind of is sort of some of the shard's power, plus we think a cognitive shadow, and
Right.
It has not like made a shard. It's definitely a different thing. Maybe that's not the best comparison because we don't exactly know what's going on there, but that's just something that popped into my mind of kind of an example of this idea of a shard power plus a cognitive shadow not equaling the same thing as a shard plus a vessel.
I think that's probably the best example, the Stormfather. But because we don't have those answers, and we might be getting them in Wind and Truth, let's move on to Kyle's secondary question, which is about Kelsier. If he's being worshipped by two different cultures and in two different ways, is he setting up that worship in order to move harmony into discord? Because the shard of harmony cannot be controlling a planet that is at war with itself.
So is the question basically just, is Kelsier like stirring the pot? Is Kelsier specifically seeding himself as a religious figure so that there will be conflict?
I think that is what I take from Kyle's question, but I know
Okay.
that there's a secondary aspect, an online group of weirdos out there who thinks that Kelsier is going to become Discord, that he will replace Zazed as the vessel, and it will be a transition from Zazed as a vessel to Kelsier as a vessel, and that will mark harmony to discord. Now, I think Kyle is merely saying, is Kelsier stirring the pot?
Yeah.
Rather than will he become discord?
I don't see. Maybe this is weird given all we know about Kelsier, but I actually don't see him as a power hungry person. Like, I don't see him as a Teravangian who is definitely always looking to have power over others or like be in a position of power. I see Kelsier more as the god killer. I could see him kind of having the ethos that even though his friend Sazed is holding the power, no one should have that much power. Anyone holding shard power is going to be dangerous to Scadrial and needs to be taken out, basically. So I would err more on the side of Kelsier is stirring the pot to try to create discord or like pull apart the shard or like weaken the shard in some way rather than take over as the shard.
I would agree. I don't necessarily think he's going to take over as the shard and become Discord, but I also think that his existence is wrong. Cognitive shadows are bad, according to Tyler, and his existence might lead to more discord and less harmony, and that might be something that Zazed as the vessel doesn't mind. I'm not 100% convinced that Zazed needs harmony to be the thing.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I think
I have a whole theory about this that I'm obsessed with that we'll talk about later.
Love it. So we appreciate Kyle's question. Let's go on to Evan's next.
My name is Evan, and I am wondering if Cosmere Conversations can answer an idea around what I would call capital E experience. Because even if we have the same experience or the same person, so rather copied and pasted, if they go on two different tracks, doesn't that inherently mean they end up being different people?
Evan. Capital E, Evan. I like this a lot. I like this new capitalized experience for an important part of the way we think about the Cosmere. And I would agree. I would say that if you had two distinct copies, and just to use a different word, because we've said copy quite a bit in this episode. Let's say a clone situation.
Okay.
2 clones. And you send those clones out into the world and you drop one on Scadrial and you drop one on Rashar. After 10 years, after any amount of time, they are not going to be the same person.
Right. It's the classic nature versus nurture debate. I would say that I do not think there is something in the Cosmere called capital E experience, because I think that this idea is encapsulated in other vocabulary words that already exist.
Got it.
I would say the spirit web is changeable. It is not immutable, to go back to our earlier question. So I think even if you were to copy or clone a spirit web and then send those 2 people on separate tracks, the spirit web is going to change and adapt, right? It's going to gain new capital C connections to new people and places, and that is going to be unique for each one of those clones. I don't totally know how capital I identity would work in that situation. My sense is that your capital I identity would sort of be the fingerprint of your spirit web, and therefore would still be distinct and unique to each clone. So I think in those 2 capital words that we already have in the Cosmere is contained Evan's idea.
I agree. I think that it is better contained in those phrases that we already have. I think identity is changeable. And we see that with Kaladin, who, though he has sworn the ideals, he cannot wash off the slave brands on his forehead because he still has that as part of his identity and therefore part of his spirit web. But those things are probably changeable. It might be part of his path that those things change.
Yeah.
And I definitely think that this concept of a clone and then what happens when you send them on 2 different paths are something we could see in the Cosmere play out, but it's not really what we've been talking about so far. We, with Kelsier as the main example, he died. There was no 2 things happening simultaneously. Kelsier is dead. And then there is the cognitive aspect that becomes the cognitive shadow, and then that cognitive shadow eventually goes by the name Thydakar, but there is no other thing existing at the same time. What would be interesting, and I don't think what we have seen, are 2 simultaneous organisms or 2 simultaneous people moving forward as and kind of like gaining their own identity, gaining their own experiences and their spiritual DNA reflecting that.
Right.
I don't think we've seen that, but I do think it's something that's possible. It just doesn't exist right now in the cosmos.
Okay. A question from another Aaron.
My name is Aaron. This can be for anyone. So my question, from what I understand, cognitive shadows, if it's like a fossil that's left behind from someone that was largely invested, does that mean the actual person themselves transitions to the beyond? And so then my question is, could there be a cognitive shadow where the person doesn't transition? So you get like, it's like if you're uploading your conscious to the internet, you upload your conscious, but you don't die. So you're still there and you have a second copy of yourself. So I'm curious if you could have a cognitive shadow copy and the person that didn't pass on, they didn't transition. And if someone figured that out, could you just make infinite cognitive shadow copies of yourself? And what would that be like?
This is kind of a perfect follow-up.
I think it goes well with the last discussion.
Well done, people. I'm going to say no. I do not think that it's possible to have a cognitive shadow and the same person from whence the cognitive shadow came at the same time. I think that we can define a person, kind of capital A, capital P person, as a combination of a bunch of different things: a physical body, a soul, a cognitive aspect, maybe a spirit web, identity, right? All of these things are kind of tangled together that creates the person that we might interact with. Upon death, those things separate.
That's how I'd see it.
Yeah. And so the body is just a body. It doesn't have anything else. The soul goes on to the beyond, and the cognitive shadow is being made from the cognitive aspect. That can only happen if the cognitive aspect has been divorced from the person. And if it's been divorced from the person is no longer the person.
I think that the only example we can point to in the Cosmere is not at the person level, but is at the shard level. Because I would argue that what Aaron is hinting at, this kind of like ability to infinitely copy themselves, is what we see with autonomy creating avatars, that they are trying to create copies of themselves that may give them benefit, but are distinct and different than the shard itself.
I'm going to say that's very different. I think Avatar is very, very different from creating a copy. I think the closest we would see to a copy in the Cosmere would be what I was talking about earlier, some use of hemalurgy to move or duplicate identity and maybe other aspects of a person. Maybe that's possible.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that's happening more on the person level.
Yeah.
And the shard level is different. It's not the same.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at with both of these responses. We haven't seen this play out, this two-tiered system. I think that the only mechanism I can imagine making it work is a tremendous amount of investiture. So we're talking about heralds or Elantrians, Yumi. Like maybe there is something where there's a father machine-like device that doesn't completely kill the Yoki-Hijo as they go through, but just separates them into two different distinct things.
And somehow prevents their soul from going to the beyond.
Exactly. I don't think that this has been seen, because that's really the problem. Is I don't think that those leftovers are the soul. I think something leaves them. And I would define, as I previously did, that means that they are unable to take up a shard because they are lacking something, a soul, as you just described it. But
yeah, I do not think that it's possible to have the person and the cognitive shadow of the person at the same time.
Yeah, the only, again, it's shard level, but like there's some speculation that Tanavas began to divest some of their power and maybe created a cognitive shadow that was attached to the Stormfather prior to their death, or that it happened the moment of their death, that there was a transition over.
Yeah, it could have happened at the moment of death because the person is no longer there.
Right.
And so the cognitive shadow went into the Stormfather.
And again, this isn't at the person level. I don't think that a person can do it. I basically think that the amount of investiture we're talking about that is required, and like the division of your spirit web, requires some type of shard.
I think even a shard, not possible. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for...
Great question, Aaron.
Really appreciate your question. And I think we're going to go to Rob for another question.
Yeah, Rob, and it'd be interesting, honestly, to get as many of you could to have this discussion, because I think it's a large one. It's like, where does Hoyd fit? Hoyd's held a Dawn Shard, but he's also, is present at the Shattering. He's also collected all the different types of investiture across the Cosmere. So does him being a Dawn Shard exclude him from fitting into one of these types of entities? Does he multiple types? And, where do people stand on it? I think it'd be really interesting.
Oh, Hoyd.
Great question, Rob. Wouldn't we all like to know, where does Hoyd fit?
Where does Hoyd fit is perhaps the entire mystery of the Cosmere.
Yeah, that's like the thesis statement of the Cosmere.
Brandon's first document was really just a 5-paragraph essay. Where does Hoyd fit?
Only 5 paragraphs?
Yeah, in the classic sense of like a high school, you have your introduction, your 3 body paragraphs, and then your conclusion. That is, you're trying to get at the answer of where does Hoyd fit. I think that it is difficult to say with certainty, but I would remind us is that during the 401 panel, we talked about cognitive shadows, splinters, slivers, and hinted at avatars as well. I don't think that Hoyd fits neatly into any one of those categories.
The only category that I think he may fit into is sliver, and a few people at the panel asked about this or like referenced it. I think that it's conceivable that Dawn Shard holders would fit into the category of sliver as well as shard holders, but we don't know enough to say for sure if those things are actually similar enough to be called the same thing. Like the truth is we just don't know enough about the Dawn Shards to have an idea of what that comparison would be and if calling them a sliver would be accurate. I think it's likely, but I don't feel confident to say that for sure. Aside from that, in terms of like what else Hoyt is, literally no clue, just big question mark.
I think that he can be definitively stated to not be a cognitive shadow. He might have a cognitive shadow.
Man?
No. See, Hoyt,
honestly, no clue.
Hoyt could be the example we don't know exists, but does exist.
We
were just talking about.
Totally.
He is still the person, Sephandrius. He, the oldest possible name. He's never died permanently, whatever that means. He's survived a lot.
And is also the cognitive shadow.
But there might also be a cognitive shadow. Maybe that's stapled onto him. Maybe it's loose in the Cosmere.
Person shadow, like not a cognitive shadow, just like a shadow of the entire person.
I think he is the only real representative of a person who can still be said to maybe also have cognitive shadows running around. He might have the copies of himself, but I think that he is, yes, so heavily invested. We know that he has Lerasium. We know that he has a lot of breath. We know that he is the Yolish version of light weaving. So he's walking around with a tremendous amount of investiture, but I think it is very important as a distinction to say that Hoyd has not died in the way that Kelsier has died.
Maybe. I mean, honestly, I don't feel like I can speculate at all for Hoyd. I feel like anything goes. It could be literally anything.
I'd probably agree with that it can be literally anything. Yeah. But right now, I'm just going to at least go out on the limb and say that Hoyd is not a cognitive shadow. He's not like the Heralds. He's not like the Return.
He could be.
I agree. He could be. We might have to come back and, redo this entire podcast episode. But I think that it's going to be on the long term proven that Hoyd is not a cognitive shadow in the way that these other characters are. And I think that distinction is important. What else Hoyd is, I don't have an answer for.
I guess we're going to read and find out. Okay, let's get to our last question from Dave.
I'm Dave. Just a general question. I had mainly about, so in Kelsier's specific instance, we see like with Spren, they can't grow and change, but they consider that death. So how similar is Kelsier's situation in that? Like, is he actually able to grow and change, or is he kind of, because we've seen him sort of devolve in some sort of ways, like to a specific intent, but yeah, what exactly do you think is going on there?
Kelsier, strangely, is easier to answer about than Hoyd is.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is actually kind of a great consolidation of all the things we've talked about in these questions. As a cognitive shadow, Kelsier cannot grow and change, I think, on his own. He is only able to change in so much as the perception of him influences the cognitive shadow.
That's interesting. It's like the new external prayers or, religious fervor, everything that's going on with survivorism. That is the only part that can help Kelsier, cognitive shadow, grow and change.
Yeah, I mean, help ? He doesn't really have any say over it. It's just the only thing that does impact the cognitive shadow. So I think, he is more like a Spren than a person, again, because if one cannot grow and change on their own, they are not alive, not the person they used to be.
And Vasher is realizing this. He seems very sad about this in Rhythm of War. When he defines Type 2 invested entities, he defines himself as Spren masquerading as men.
Yes.
I think that Heralds, I think that Kelsier or Thydakar are Spren masquerading as men.
That is why I think it's helpful to, for example, refer to Kelsier presently as Thydakar, because I think it's important for us to remember that these are not the same being, that the Kelsier that we knew did in fact die.
Yes.
So like Dave is saying, if Spren grow and change, they consider it death. Yeah, absolutely. The Kelsier that we knew is dead and gone. The thing that is now around that looks like Kelsier, that is wearing Kelsier's identity, is Thydakar, is a different thing.
I would agree, and I come back to this is why cognitive shadows are bad, because that sets up a diversion point from the quote-unquote real Kelsier. Whatever Thydakar is now, it's not Kelsier. It might have memories, it might have capital I identity, it might have a lot of things that are Kelsier-like, but it is not Kelsier.
Yeah, I guess if we go back to the metaphor of like uploading your consciousness to a computer, again, it may have all of the like memories and some of the mannerisms of that person, but it is either incapable of change from the moment of upload or only capable of change through external manipulation. If someone comes into the computer and is like, actually, I want you to be more friendly or blah, 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 changes the program that is your consciousness.
I would only present this bit of pushback and say that it might be the case that Kelsier, Cognitive Shadow, realized that problem, which is why he worked so hard to get back into a physical body, thinking that that might alleviate or, you know, somehow give him more freedom and more choice in the matter. Because if he's back in all three realms, hypothetically, then he is closer to a human than just the cognitive shadow that was operating in the in-between. Because we don't know when he became the body that we see in the Lost Metal.
That's true.
So there's kind of like distinct points. There's Kelsier, the person in Era 1 who taught and trained Vin. That person dies at the hands of the Lord Ruler. There's the cognitive aspect that runs to the Well of Ascension and is expanded, becoming the cognitive shadow Kelsier. And then there is when that thing, the cognitive shadow, gets back into a body, which we could call Thydakar. We could call whatever point you want Thydakar, but there's arguments about like why he got back into a body. Was that helpful or was that limiting in some fashion?
I think a comparison would be the Heralds, who also respawn in their own body, I will say. We don't know what Kelsier, like how Kelsier got a new body.
Right. Is he zombie Kelsier?
Right. But like the Heralds we know are spawning in their own bodies. And we have a word of Brandon saying that at least a contributing factor to the Herald's magical maladies is the influence of perception on them that like is impacting them and changing them, in addition to the great number of years that they've lived. So I don't see that the physical body is like really helping them a lot kind of resist that. So I don't know if it would be the same with Kelsier, maybe not, but I think the Heralds are a good example that just having a physical body is maybe not going to help as much as Kelsier wants it to.
It may not help as much as he wants to, or may not help permanently, but I think it might be better than just him floating around as a cognitive shadow. That's kind of the distinction. Is it a small improvement to have a physical body in the Cosmere? And I believe that everything that we've talked about in these responses, everything that the panelists got up to in 401, and everything that we have been and will continue to be talking about in our Cosmere Dictionary episodes really brings to light these separate distinctions. So thank you so much for everyone who asked us questions. Thank you all for being listeners. This has been a great wrap up to what was 2024 and the last little things that we did in 2024. And now we will start to move forward into the new year, but also with new perspectives and starting to add in wind and truth perspectives and our greater speculations about the future of the cosmos. Brooke, do you have any final words before we say our goodbyes?
Just want to extend another thanks to everyone who came out to the panel, everyone who recorded questions for us, and any new podcast listeners. We are just so happy to be having these Cosmere conversations with you. And until next time, life before death,
strength before weakness,
journey before destination.